If we begin in the late 19th century, we find a nation moving faster than it ever had before. The Civil War is over, Reconstruction is fading, and the United States is no longer a fragile republic recovering from conflict. It is becoming an industrial force. Steel mills operate day and night, producing the metal that will frame bridges, railroads, and skyscrapers. Rail lines stretch across the continent, linking distant regions into one national market. Oil refineries, textile factories, and financial institutions expand at a remarkable pace. Industry is booming. Fortunes are being made on a scale that would have been unimaginable just a generation earlier. A small group of business leaders now control enterprises so vast that they shape entire sectors of the economy. Their decisions influence prices, employment, transportation, and trade. To many Americans, this growth feels like proof that the nation's promise is real. Opportunity appears boundless, progress seems unstoppable. And yet, prosperity is not shared equally. While some men build business empires, millions of workers experience a very different reality. They labor long hours in factories filled with noise and heat. They descend into mines where danger is constant. They work on railroad lines where a single mistake can be fatal. In rapidly expanding cities, families crowd into small tenement apartments near industrial districts. Wages are modest, job security is uncertain. Illness or injury can mean immediate financial crisis. Two versions of America are developing at the same time. One is defined by wealth, expansion, and influence. The other is defined by endurance, vulnerability, and limited opportunity. The nation as a whole is growing stronger, economically and technologically. But beneath that growth lies an uncomfortable tension. If this era represents progress, who benefits from it? Is inequality simply an unavoidable stage in national development? Or is something deeper taking shape, a struggle over fairness, power, and the meaning of the American dream? These questions would not remain abstract. They would define an age. The rise of the robber barons. As the 19th century moved forward, a new kind of American leader emerged, not a general, not a politician, but an industrial titan. These were men who did not merely participate in the economy. They reshaped it. One of the most powerful was John D. Rockefeller. Through his company, Standard Oil, Rockefeller refined, transported, and marketed the majority of the nation's petroleum. By carefully buying out competitors and negotiating favorable railroad rates, he built a corporation so dominant that, at its peak, it controlled nearly 90% of America's oil refining capacity. In steel, Andrew Carnegie rose from humble beginnings to command a vast industrial empire. Carnegie Steel became the backbone of America's infrastructure, producing the steel that built railroads, bridges, and skyscrapers. His mills operated with relentless efficiency, lowering production costs and outpacing competitors. In transportation, Cornelius Vanderbilt consolidated railroad lines across the Northeast. By linking fragmented rail systems into coordinated networks, he helped standardize travel and shipping. Railroads became the arteries of American commerce, and Vanderbilt stood at their center. And in finance, J.P. Morgan wielded influence that extended beyond any single industry. Morgan reorganized failing railroads, financed major corporations, and orchestrated massive mergers. In moments of economic panic, the federal government itself turned to him for stability. These men did not simply accumulate wealth, they engineered systems. Their success relied on powerful business strategies. Horizontal integration meant buying out or merging with competitors in the same industry, reducing competition and increasing market control. Rockefeller mastered this approach in oil refining. Vertical integration meant controlling every stage of production, from raw materials to distribution. Carnegie applied this strategy in steel, owning mines, rail lines, and mills, all feeding into one coordinated operation. To maintain control, many corporations formed trusts, legal arrangements that allowed multiple companies to be managed under a single board. Over time, some of these trusts evolved into monopolies, dominating entire industries and limiting competition. To their supporters, these strategies were signs of brilliance and efficiency. Admirers called them captains of industry. They argued that these leaders created jobs, lowered consumer prices, expanded infrastructure, and transformed the United States into a global economic power. Without their vision, supporters believed, America would not have modernized so rapidly. But critics saw something different. They saw small businesses crushed under the weight of predatory pricing. They saw competitors driven out of markets through aggressive buyouts. They saw political influence leveraged to protect corporate interests. They saw wealth concentrating at unprecedented levels. These critics labeled them robber barons, suggesting that fortunes had been built not merely through innovation, but through exploitation and manipulation. Underlying much of the era's thinking was the idea of social Darwinism, the belief that economic success reflected natural superiority. According to this view, competition in business mirrored survival in nature. Those who rose to the top were considered the fittest, while those who struggled were seen as less capable. This philosophy provided moral justification for vast inequality. By the height of the Gilded Age, the wealth gap had grown strikingly wide. A small number of industrialists commanded fortunes larger than the budgets of entire states. Meanwhile, millions of workers earned wages that barely sustained their families. The contrast was stark. Lavish estates stood within sight of crowded tenements. Private rail cars existed alongside dangerous rail yards. Opulence and hardship expanded together. The rise of these industrial leaders reshaped the American economy forever. But as their power grew, so too did a question that could not be ignored. Was this concentration of wealth a triumph of opportunity, or a warning sign of imbalance? The answer would not remain theoretical for long. Life for the working class. While industrial leaders expanded their empires, the daily reality for millions of workers looked very different. For the average laborer in the late 19th century, the workday was long and physically demanding. 10 to 14 hours was common. 6 days a week was standard. Sunday was often the only day of rest, and even that could be uncertain for those struggling to make ends meet. Wages were low, especially for unskilled laborers. Pay was often just enough to cover rent, food, and basic necessities, with little left over for savings. A missed week of work due to illness or injury could push a family into immediate hardship. There were no federal safety regulations, no guaranteed minimum wage, no overtime protections, no workers' compensation. If a worker was injured, he was usually dismissed without pay. In factories, machines operated at high speeds, often without protective guards. Loose clothing could become trapped in gears. Hands and fingers were crushed in presses. Industrial accidents were not rare events. They were accepted risks of the job. In steel mills, laborers worked near extreme heat, molten metal, and heavy equipment. In textile mills, cotton dust filled the air, damaging lungs over time. In meatpacking plants and manufacturing facilities, the pace of production left little room for caution. Coal mining was even more dangerous. Miners descended deep underground where cave-ins, gas explosions, and poor ventilation were constant threats. A single spark could ignite methane gas and cause catastrophic loss of life. Many miners spent their entire careers in darkness, breathing in coal dust that scarred their lungs. Railroad workers faced hazards of a different kind. Coupling rail cars required men to stand between moving trains, a task that frequently resulted in crushed limbs or death. Brakemen, engineers, and track layers worked in all weather conditions, often far from medical care. Children, too, became part of this industrial workforce. In textile mills, boys and girls tended machines because their small hands could reach into tight spaces. In coal mines, young boys known as breaker boys sat for long hours separating coal from rock. On city streets, children sold newspapers, shined shoes, or carried goods to supplement family income. Education was often sacrificed for survival. At the same time, millions of immigrants were arriving in the United States, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe. They came seeking opportunity, fleeing poverty, political unrest, or limited prospects in their home countries. America's expanding industries needed labor, and immigrants filled that demand. Many settled in crowded urban neighborhoods near factories and docks. Language barriers and unfamiliar laws made them especially vulnerable to exploitation. Yet they endured harsh conditions in the hope of building better futures for their families. In this environment, workers were often viewed as replaceable. If one man protested wages or conditions, another stood ready to take his place. The steady stream of immigration ensured a constant supply of labor. Employers understood this, and many used it to their advantage. The imbalance of power was clear. Industrial growth depended on human labor, yet individual workers had little protection and limited influence. Their effort fueled the nation's expansion, but their security remained uncertain. For many working families, progress did not feel like prosperity. It felt like endurance. The spark of resistance, birth of labor unions. As industrial growth accelerated and working conditions remained harsh, frustration began to turn into organization. For years, many workers had endured long hours, low pay, and unsafe environments in silence. But by the late 19th century, a new realization was spreading. Individually, a worker had little power. Collectively, they might have a voice. One of the earliest large-scale labor organizations to emerge was the Knights of Labor. Founded in 1869, the Knights of Labor sought to unite workers across trades and skill levels. Unlike many later unions, they welcomed both skilled and unskilled laborers. They also admitted women and, in some cases, African American workers, a significant step in an era of widespread exclusion. The Knights advocated broad reforms. They called for the 8-hour workday, safer working conditions, and fair wages. They opposed child labor and supported the idea that workers should have a greater say in the economic system that depended on their labor. For a time, their membership grew rapidly. Strikes organized by the Knights demonstrated that coordinated action could pressure employers to negotiate. Soon after, another influential organization emerged, the American Federation of Labor, or AFL, founded in 1886 under the leadership of Samuel Gompers. The AFL took a more focused approach. Rather than seeking sweeping social reform, it concentrated on practical improvements for skilled workers, higher wages, shorter hours, and safer workplaces. It emphasized collective bargaining and direct negotiation with employers. Though different in structure and strategy, both organizations reflected the same underlying shift. Workers were no longer willing to accept conditions without question. They demanded limits to the workday. They demanded safer factories and mines. They demanded compensation that reflected the value of their labor. They demanded an end to the widespread use of child labor. But organizing was not without risk. Employers often viewed unions as threats to authority and profit. Workers suspected of union activity could be fired immediately. Many companies maintained blacklists, informal records of labor activists shared among employers. Once blacklisted, a worker could struggle to find employment anywhere in the industry. Private security forces and local law enforcement were sometimes used to break strikes. In some cases, state militias or federal troops intervened. The legal system frequently sided with business owners, issuing injunctions to halt labor actions. The imbalance of power remained significant, yet the idea of collective action continued to grow. The relationship between labor and capital was changing. What had once been individual grievances were becoming organized demands. As industries expanded and wealth concentrated at the top, workers increasingly saw their struggle not as isolated hardship, but as part of a larger pattern. Tension began to build across factories, railroads, and mines. The rise of labor unions did not immediately resolve inequality, but it ensured that the conflict between workers and industrial leaders would no longer remain quiet. The confrontation between labor and capital was becoming unavoidable. Strikes that shook the nation. By the late 19th century, the tension between workers and industrial leaders could no longer be contained within factory walls. It spilled into the streets, onto railroad tracks, and into the national spotlight. The first major eruption came in 1877. The nation was still recovering from the panic of 1873, a severe economic depression that led to widespread unemployment and financial instability. Railroad companies facing declining profits announced another round of wage cuts. For workers who were already struggling, this reduction felt like a final blow. In July of 1877, railroad workers in West Virginia walked off the job. What began as a local protest quickly spread along the rail lines to Maryland, Pennsylvania, Illinois, and beyond. Freight trains stopped moving. Rail yards filled with idle equipment. Crowds gathered in support. The Great Railroad Strike of 1877 had begun, the first nationwide labor strike in American history. As unrest grew, state militias were called in. In some cities, violence erupted between protesters and authorities. When local forces proved insufficient, President Rutherford B. Hayes authorized the deployment of federal troops. Soldiers entered major cities to restore order and protect railroad property. Clashes left dozens dead. Property was destroyed. Within weeks, the strike was suppressed. The message was clear. When conflict escalated, the federal government would act to defend commerce and restore order, even if it meant using military force against workers. Nearly a decade later, in 1886, another confrontation altered the national conversation. In Chicago, labor activists organized a rally in support of the 8-hour workday. The event followed days of tension and smaller strikes across the city. On May 4th, during what had begun as a peaceful gathering in Haymarket Square, an unknown individual threw a bomb into a line of police officers attempting to disperse the crowd. The explosion killed several officers and triggered gunfire in the chaos that followed. The Haymarket affair shocked the nation. Although the person responsible for the bomb was never definitively identified, several labor activists were arrested and tried. The trial was controversial, and some historians later questioned its fairness. Nevertheless, several men were convicted, and 4 were executed. Public opinion shifted sharply. Many Americans began associating labor unions with radicalism and violence. Support for organized labor declined, and businesses used the event to justify crackdowns on union activity. The conflict continued into the 1890s. In 1892, the Homestead Strike unfolded in Pennsylvania at one of Andrew Carnegie's steel plants. While Carnegie was abroad, his business partner Henry Clay Frick announced wage reductions for unionized workers. When negotiations failed, Frick moved to break the union. The company hired Pinkerton agents, private security guards, to secure the mill and protect replacement workers. When the Pinkertons attempted to enter the plant by river barge, armed workers and townspeople confronted them. A violent battle followed. Shots were exchanged. Lives were lost on both sides. Eventually, the state militia was called in to restore control. The strike collapsed, and the union's presence at the Homestead plant was effectively destroyed. The event became a symbol of the growing divide between labor and capital, and the willingness of companies to use force to maintain control. Just 2 years later, in 1894, another national crisis emerged. The Pullman strike began after the Pullman Palace Car Company reduced wages without lowering rents in company-owned housing. Workers, already under financial strain, protested the imbalance. When negotiations failed, railway workers, led by the American Railway Union under Eugene V. Debs, launched a boycott of trains carrying Pullman cars. Rail traffic across much of the country was disrupted. Once again, federal authorities intervened. President Grover Cleveland sent federal troops to ensure the movement of mail and interstate commerce. Clashes followed, and the strike was ultimately broken. Debs was arrested and later imprisoned. Each of these events revealed a consistent pattern. When labor disputes escalated into national crises, the government frequently aligned itself with business interests. Courts issued injunctions against unions. Troops protected corporate property. The priority, officials argued, was maintaining order and economic stability. To many workers, however, the message felt unmistakable. The power of the state stood closer to capital than to labor. The strikes of this era did not immediately secure lasting victories for workers, but they transformed the national dialogue. They exposed the depth of inequality and forced Americans to confront difficult questions about fairness, authority, and the limits of industrial power. The struggle between workers and industrial leaders was no longer hidden in factory shadows. It had become a defining conflict of the age. Public opinion begins to shift. For years, the struggles of industrial workers had remained largely confined to factories, mines, and crowded neighborhoods. But by the end of the 19th century, those realities were becoming harder to ignore. A new generation of journalists began investigating the hidden costs of industrial growth. These writers would later be known as muckrakers, a term popularized in the early 20th century to describe reporters who exposed corruption, injustice, and social problems. Through detailed investigative reporting, they brought the experiences of ordinary workers into the homes of middle-class readers. One of the most influential voices was Jacob Riis. In 1890, Riis published How the Other Half Lives, combining writing with powerful photographs of tenement life in New York City. His work revealed overcrowded housing, poor sanitation, and extreme poverty. For many Americans, it was the first time they had seen visual evidence of how industrial workers actually lived. The images were difficult to dismiss. A few years later, in 1906, Upton Sinclair published The Jungle. Although slightly outside the Gilded Age period, Sinclair's novel reflected the same growing reform spirit. By depicting harsh conditions inside Chicago's meatpacking plants, he shocked readers nationwide. The book stirred outrage, not only over worker exploitation but also over unsanitary food production. Together, these works reshaped public awareness. Middle-class Americans, who had once viewed labor unrest as disorderly or radical, began to reconsider. Industrial growth was still admired, but its consequences were becoming clearer. The gap between wealth and poverty, once seen as distant or inevitable, now felt immediate and visible. Reform movements began to gain strength. Religious leaders spoke about social justice. Civic organizations pushed for housing reform and workplace safety. Advocates demanded restrictions on child labor and shorter workdays. The idea that government should play a role in protecting public welfare slowly gained acceptance. Even at the federal level, the first steps toward regulating corporate power had already begun. In 1890, Congress passed the Sherman Antitrust Act. The law aimed to limit monopolies and restore competition by prohibiting business practices that restrain trade. Although early enforcement was inconsistent, the act signaled an important shift. The federal government was acknowledging that unchecked corporate power could threaten economic fairness. The legislation alone did not dismantle monopolies overnight, but it established a principle that private enterprise, no matter how powerful, was not beyond public scrutiny. Gradually, Americans began asking new questions. Should a handful of corporations control entire industries? Should business leaders hold influence strong enough to shape markets without limits? And what responsibility did the government have to balance opportunity with fairness? The era of unquestioned admiration for industrial titans was fading. In its place emerged a growing belief that progress required accountability. Public opinion was changing, not suddenly, but steadily, and that shift would lay the groundwork for a new period of reform. The moral debate, wealth and responsibility. By the late 19th century, America faced not only an economic struggle, but a moral one. Industrial fortunes had grown to astonishing levels. A small group of men now controlled resources greater than those of entire communities. Their decisions shaped industries, influenced politics, and affected the daily lives of millions. The question was no longer simply how wealth was created, it was what should be done with it. One of the most prominent voices in this debate was Andrew Carnegie. In 1889, Carnegie published an essay titled The Gospel of Wealth. In it, he acknowledged a reality many Americans could see for themselves. Modern industry had produced vast inequality. Some individuals possessed enormous fortunes, while others struggled to survive on modest wages. But Carnegie did not see this imbalance as entirely negative. He argued that the concentration of wealth was a natural result of competition in an advanced economy. According to his view, industrial leaders had developed skills in organization, efficiency, and management that allowed them to generate extraordinary prosperity. Society, he believed, ultimately benefited from this system, through economic growth, lower costs, and expanded opportunity. However, Carnegie insisted that wealth carried responsibility. The rich, he wrote, were not owners in the absolute sense. They were trustees. Their surplus wealth should be used to improve society, not merely to enrich themselves or their descendants. Instead of leaving large inheritances, they should invest in institutions that uplifted the public. Carnegie practiced this philosophy on a remarkable scale. He funded the construction of more than 2,500 public libraries around the world. He supported universities, scientific research, and cultural organizations. He believed that providing access to knowledge and education gave individuals the tools to improve their own lives. In his view, philanthropy was the moral answer to inequality. Yet this ideal coexisted with a harsher reality. In the same era that Carnegie financed libraries, his steel mills demanded long hours and strict discipline from workers. During the Homestead Strike of 1892, when wage disputes escalated into violent confrontation, the image of industrial harmony fractured. Workers who believed they were being treated unfairly faced private security forces and eventually state militia intervention. This contradiction did not go unnoticed. To critics, philanthropy seemed insufficient, even contradictory. They questioned whether charitable donations could offset the hardships endured by laborers during the process of accumulating wealth. Was generosity at the end of success enough to justify the conditions that produced it? Supporters countered that without the drive, ambition, and discipline of industrial leaders, there would be no wealth to distribute at all. They argued that economic progress required strong leadership and difficult decisions. In their view, philanthropy demonstrated responsibility, not hypocrisy. The debate extended beyond one individual. It touched on the fundamental structure of American society. Should fairness depend on voluntary generosity from the wealthy? Or should fairness be protected through laws and regulations that apply to all? At its heart, the moral question remained clear. Can enormous wealth coexist with fairness? Can a society celebrate extraordinary success while ensuring dignity and opportunity for those whose labor sustains that success? The Gilded Age did not resolve these questions, but it forced Americans to confront them directly, and the answers would shape the reforms of the 20th century and continue to echo far beyond it. The Progressive Era Turning Point. By the early 20th century, the tension between industrial power and worker vulnerability had reached a breaking point. Decades of strikes, investigative journalism, public debate, and visible inequality had changed the national mood. Americans were no longer asking whether reform was necessary. Increasingly, they were asking how far it should go. This shift marked the beginning of what historians call the Progressive Era. The conflict between wealthy industrial leaders and organized labor did not disappear, but it began to reshape the role of government itself. One major area of reform focused on workplace safety. Industrial accidents had long been accepted as unavoidable. But public awareness, especially after highly publicized tragedies, forced lawmakers to reconsider that assumption. States began passing laws requiring safer factory conditions, better ventilation, and fire precautions. Over time, workers' compensation systems were introduced, ensuring that injured employees or their families received financial support rather than immediate dismissal. The idea was simple, yet revolutionary for its time. Economic progress should not come at the cost of human life without accountability. Child labor also came under increasing scrutiny. For decades, children had worked in mills, mines, and factories to supplement family income. Reformers argued that childhood should be devoted to education and development, not industrial labor. States began passing laws limiting the number of hours children could work and setting minimum age requirements. Though enforcement varied, the principle was clear. The youngest members of society deserved protection. At the federal level, the issue of corporate power moved to the forefront. The Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890 had established a legal foundation for regulating monopolies, but it was not aggressively enforced at first. That changed under President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt did not oppose business itself. He believed in a strong economy and admired efficiency. However, he rejected the idea that corporations should operate without limits. During his presidency, the federal government pursued antitrust lawsuits against powerful trusts, including major railroad and oil interests. This effort earned Roosevelt a reputation as a trust buster. His administration argued that competition, not monopoly, was essential for fairness and economic stability. The goal was not to eliminate large corporations, but to ensure they operated within the law and did not abuse their power. Under progressive leadership, federal oversight expanded in other areas as well. Regulatory agencies were strengthened. Laws were introduced to monitor railroad rates and prevent unfair business practices. Food and drug regulations were enacted to protect consumers from unsafe products. Gradually, the federal government assumed a more active role in balancing economic growth with public welfare. The transformation was significant. In earlier decades, government had often sided openly with business owners during labor disputes. By the progressive era, the role of government was being redefined. It was no longer seen solely as a protector of property and commerce. It was increasingly viewed as a mediator, responsible for ensuring fairness, competition, and safety. The fight between so-called robber barons and workers had altered the American system. Industrial leaders had demonstrated the power of private enterprise. Workers had demonstrated the power of collective action. Reformers had demonstrated the power of public pressure. Together, these forces reshaped American governments. The progressive era did not eliminate inequality. It did not end labor conflict, but it marked a turning point. For the first time, there was widespread agreement that progress required rules, and that economic strength must be accompanied by accountability. The nation had entered a new phase. Industrial America would continue to grow, but from this point forward, it would do so under closer scrutiny, shaped not only by wealth, but by the demand for fairness. Finally, as we step back from the strikes, the speeches, the boardrooms, and the factory floors, a larger question remains: who won? The industrialists undeniably transformed the United States. They built railroads that connected oceans. They financed steel that shaped skylines. They organized corporations that modernized production and expanded global trade. Universities, libraries, research institutions, and foundations still bear their names. Their influence on infrastructure and economic development is woven into the fabric of the nation. At the same time, workers reshaped America in a different, but equally lasting way. Through strikes, organization, and persistence, they pushed the country to recognize protections we now consider basic. The 8-hour workday, workplace safety standards, restrictions on child labor. The principle that injuries on the job should not mean financial ruin. These were not gifts. They were the result of sustained effort, negotiation, and at times sacrifice. Modern labor laws were not born from comfort. They were born from conflict. In truth, the outcome was not a simple victory for one side over the other. Industrial leaders proved that ambition and organization could generate extraordinary growth. Workers proved that growth without fairness creates instability. Reformers proved that democratic systems can adapt when pressure builds. America did not become fair overnight. It evolved, sometimes painfully, through tension, sacrifice, and reform. The system bent under strain, but it did not break. Instead, it adjusted. And perhaps that is the deeper answer. The fight between wealth and labor did not destroy the nation. It forced it to mature. It compelled Americans to ask difficult questions about power, responsibility, and opportunity. It reshaped the relationship between business and government. It strengthened the expectation that progress must include protection. The Gilded Age revealed both the promise and the peril of rapid growth. The reforms that followed demonstrated that democracy, though imperfect, can respond to imbalance. The debate over wealth and fairness did not end in 1914. In many ways, it continues today. But the foundation of that conversation was built in this era, when two Americas confronted one another and in doing so, reshaped the future of the nation. Thank you for watching. If you found this piece of history compelling, please like this video and subscribe for more stories that shaped our world.